multi-scalar analyses and begin with a focus on the micro scale. And so I want to talk about, and this is let me give a trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about sexual violence. When I think about the micro scale, one of the most important things that feminist scholars and feminist environmental justice scholars have talked about is the body. The body as a site of struggle for environmental justice. And if that's the case, then we find that sexual violence is a particularly horrifying example of environmental injustice. If our bodies can be redefined as lands, as the environment, as part of their environment, then any assault against our bodies can be thought of as relevant to environmental justice struggles. So let's go to China and to East Turkestan, where we are, so of course, right now witnessing anti-Uyghur oppression. Some would call it genocide by the Chinese state. Concentration camps have been set up all over the place for the purpose of re-education and assimilation. We find numerous examples of environmental injustices. Food portions are limited when food is available. Water is often polluted and contaminated, drinking water. And of course, there are forced labor camps as well. And these Uyghur folks are often making products that are associated with up to 83 common brand names associated with Samsung, Gap, Volkswagen, Nike, and Apple, for example. But sexual violence is endemic in these facilities. And I apologize, there's a typo there. It says China's increasing sterilization in Xinjiang. It should be Xinjiang with an I there. That, of course, is the name that the Chinese state has given to Uyghurstan or East Turkestan. But the most common reason that Uyghurs are sentenced to camps in many cases is for having, quote unquote, too many children, according to the Chinese state. And so anyone who has more than 3 children pose a threat to the goal of assimilation and absorption of Uyghur culture into dominant Han Chinese culture. And so some folks are given extremely long sentences, decades-long sentences for having, quote unquote, too many children. And women in many of these camps are routinely subjected to forced pregnancy tests, sterilization, and abortions. And we can see in this chart, of course, a dramatic increase in that form of sexual violence. But this, of course, if I'm jumping scale, is part of a much broader problem of anti-Uyghur oppression by the Chinese state that is located, again, in an area where, the Chinese empire is expanding. East Turkestan is like 1/6 of the Chinese landmass, but sits in a location that is extremely rich in coal, natural gas, and oil reserves. 20% of China's energy reserves sits here in East Turkestan, which is the primary territory of the Uyghur people. 24 coal fields and counting. And what's fascinating is the second most promising province in all of China with respect to wind and solar power potential. And so, as many activists have pointed out, the only thing standing in the way of the Chinese state's ability to extract and profit from this energy are Uyghur folks who are resisting that. And so this is a way of connecting the micro scale of human immobility in these concentration camps to the macro scale of geopolitics associated with ecological wealth or natural resource extraction in the service of empire. I also want to point out, of course, really importantly, that food injustices are something that prisoners are facing all around the world. This is linked to the problem of, in the framing of environmental injustice, because this reflects the ways in which marginalized populations access to key ecological resources, aka food, are controlled and often curtailed by dominant institutions. And so there's very little incentive for prisons and jails in the United States or anywhere in the world to provide, frankly, healthy and nutritious foodstuffs. And so this is a trend that I've seen throughout the world. And we're seeing prisoners push back through lawsuits and through hunger strikes. So that last bullet point there in Maricopa County, Arizona, a few years ago, we saw a 3-day hunger strike by prisoners protesting the low quality food there. And then if we jump virtually anywhere on planet Earth where there are carceral spaces, we will see this. So the Makala prison, the largest penitentiary in the Democratic Republic, or the not so Democratic Republic of the Congo, we saw in January of last year, 2020, just in 1 month, 17 imprisoned persons die of starvation in this prison, the largest carceral facility there. Aid workers were pointing out that the deaths were caused by not only a lack of food, but a lack of medicine, and of course, poor hygiene, something that is endemic to the prison system. That prison had reportedly received no food for something like 2 months as of that date. Forced labor is something we see in prisons from California to this carceral facility in Myanmar. This is a photo of inmates walking across a plantation area near the Yarzagyo prison labor camp in Kalai Township in Myanmar. This, the brutal treatment of prisoners, including Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, is legendary. Forced labor camps are sites where prisoners are receiving very little food, very little water, very little medicine, and are required to harvest agricultural products for the nation under extreme conditions. Many hundreds of prisoners in Myanmar have died in these labor camps in recent years, but this is also a project where we're seeing the intersection of some fascinating politics. Nativist and anti-immigration politics are rife here because we're seeing the nation of Myanmar trying to push back against the unauthorized crossings of migrants from India, of course. And so what they're doing, the state of Myanmar is setting up these buffer zones essentially on that border, setting up these agricultural zones and forced labor camps to populate that part of the border to prevent unauthorized migration, forcing people to engage in agricultural extraction. Another important sort of intersection between these porous boundaries between India, the nation states of India and Myanmar, of course, are the porous boundaries between these categories of the human and the non-human. The prison department deputy director of the government of Myanmar informed a journalist recently about the brutal working conditions in one of these labor camps. He explained that many of the imprisoned persons have died there, not only for lack of food and medicine, but primarily, quote, because prisoners were used in place of cattle and bulls to plow the fields, end quote. So this is what I call the racial discourse of animality, the ways in which certain categories of human beings, and in this case, various ethnic groups and various imprisoned groups, are viewed as subhuman or not human as all, and can be actually substituted for non-human labor. Oh, inadequate medical care, I've referenced that. Let me just briefly say, this is a photo from the largest penitentiary in the nation of Haiti, where diseases like cholera and TB are spreading like wildfire. This is a photo of one cell that has 18 beds, but 60 prisoners. And so during a time of COVID pandemic, physical distancing, social distancing is impossible. One prisoner told a journalist from BBC, quote, "We can't get proper medical care in this prison. It's stressful. We are thinking of our children, our wives, and our families who are on the outside, and it makes you ill," end quote. In other words, the very stress and anxiety associated with improper or non-existent medical care is an additional health risk on top of the fact that these folks are already facing TB or cholera. And so medical care remains a major issue in prisons around the world. We go to the island, the territory, the colony known as Puerto Rico. This is a map here of all the major prisons on the island. And amazingly enough, they are all located in flood zones. And so in the fall of 2017, as we all know, Hurricane Irma, a major climate change driven extreme weather event, hit the island of Puerto Rico, in addition to other places, extremely hard, flooding parts of the island and of course, placing many people's lives and livelihoods at risk. And I would say that there are a few places more terrifying to be during a climate change driven extreme weather event like a flooding prison. Most of Puerto Rico's prisons, as I said, are located in flood zones. This is something we see in the United States and other parts of the world, placing imprisoned people in harm's way, creating another layer, an additional stress of environmental and climate injustice that intersects with the already violent and brutal carceral system. Now, in terms of this second pillar of looking at multi-scalar analyses, I continue to use this term slavery or enslavement, and this, of course, is referencing the temporal, the historical reality in the United States that enslavement is perfectly legal, according to the 13th Amendment, something that, curiously, I've had arguments with formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated people and their allies, because so many people think that, you know, slavery in the United States is only when you're in prison and you're being forced to do labor. But it says here in plain English in black and white that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for punishment for a crime, meaning you don't have to be forced to labor to be enslaved in the United States. You only have to be caged. Feel free to push back and disagree with me on that. But the point here also, again, this goes back to the idea that many scholars argue that abolishing the prison industrial complex today is an important effort to complete the work of abolition centuries ago, that began centuries ago. Here in the United States, we see some fascinating intersections between enslavement and the prison system and climate and environmental justice. This is a photo from many years ago of convict leasing in action. All African-American folks enslaved here being leased out by the states of Alabama and Tennessee and other places like that to the Tennessee Iron and Coal Corporation through that system of convict leasing. What is their job? Their unpaid labor, their forced labor, is to extract coal, which, of course, unbeknownst to them at the time, was and remains an activity that's perpetrating global anthropogenic climate change. So I've talked about pillars 1 and 2, expanding categories of difference, doing multi-scalar analyses. I want to quickly talk about pillars 3 and 4, again, questioning state-centric analyses and politics and rejecting expendability and embracing indispensability. And I'm arguing that these two pillars are sort of nicely sort of bound up in the work that imprisoned folks and their allies are already doing with respect to resistance. So here's a bit of a laundry list of some of the kinds of activities and actions we see inside and outside of carceral spaces: hunger strikes, boycotts, commissary strikes. We've seen that in popular media, cultural products like Orange is the New Black. Of course, the good old standby of lawsuits, the outrageous crime of asking for clean water, demanding access to showers. Here in the state of California, which is drought-stricken, this continues to be a struggle. As I've talked about, demanding healthy food and healthcare. But as a scholar, as an educator, one of the most fascinating things to me is to see imprisoned folks around the world demanding more access to education, including and especially sociology, ethnic studies, and women's studies programs. One Chinese immigrant, Eddie Zhang, who served many years at San Quentin Penitentiary here in California, was thrown into the hole, into solitary confinement for 11 months for requesting that there be an ethnic studies, and in particular, an Asian American studies curriculum at San Quentin. So these demands don't come without risk and consequences. Here in the United States, we've seen a resistance movement embracing environmental justice and social justice and human rights for prisoners and for people on the other side of the prison walls, going back at least as far, at least formally, as the 1980s and 1990s, when groups like MEDLA, Mothers of East Los Angeles, and groups like Critical Resistance were really creating these intersecting struggles, right? Connecting the dots between environmental justice, prisoner justice, and human rights, and fighting against incinerators, oil pipelines, and jails and prisons in South Los Angeles and Delano, California. The resistance is also global, and this is something I've been doing interviews with prisoners or formerly incarcerated folks about. This is a photo of Camp Olivas in a detention center in the Philippines. Political prisoners in the Philippines under the Marcos regime, according to Amnesty International, topped out at somewhere around 70,000 and counting. We'll see if Duterte can beat that record. It's quite extraordinary. And they work with allies on the outside Groups like SELDA, S-E-L-D-A, look that up, and Karapatan. These are extraordinary organizations that try to make the struggles of political prisoners and other prisoners more visible. One former political prisoner, Joana Carino, served time here in the Women's Detention Center at Camp Olivos during the Marcos era. And she recounted how many political prisoners were engaged in various forms of resistance, struggling to create mutual aid networks and to provide support and care for folks on the inside. She told me, quote, there were 2 pregnant women who were arrested. They were activists, and they were the focus of one of our early demands, which was to have them released on humanitarian grounds because they were going to shortly deliver their babies, but they were not being released. And they actually gave birth in prison. And the Women's Detention Center then became a site where we were all collectively taking care of these 2 infants, you know? We would do the washing of the diapers every morning, and all of us would take care of them. So in a sense, they had a lot of mothers, and eventually we ended up being their godmothers. It was a continuing campaign, though, to have them released, and they actually were eventually released ahead of time. So in that sense, that campaign was a success, end quote. But she continued with a discussion of prisoner responses to food injustices at Camp Olivos. Quote, because the budget for food is really low, the food is really terrible. And many of the prison struggles that you see are really focused on improving the food. And there's also corruption involved. So whenever there's a very small budget, which is always, it gets corrupted. And that's why prisoners have to supplement their food, because otherwise there's just nothing. Tasteless and small servings and hardly any protein. So you have to supplement your food. And just as long as there is an area where you can plant food, you can do that. So we planted vegetables like eggplants, okra, beans, which supplemented the prison diet, which otherwise was nothing to speak of, end quote. Finally, she talked about some of the more day-to-day activities focused on survival that I would also label as resistance. She talked about producing greeting cards for friends and families using pressed flowers. Quote, we learned a lot of things, including how to sew pants. I actually sewed a pair of jeans when I was under detention. And of course, you build lasting friendships, end quote. So that's an example of the kind of day-to-day resistance that we see. I have referenced hunger strikes before, and I'm going to do that again. Earlier, I talked about Rohingya refugees in a Saudi Arabian migrant detention center in a prison there. In that same prison, many Rohingya Muslim refugees who have been there for years because they're in the country, many of them without authorization, have also resisted using that time-tested form of resistance, the hunger strike. So in April of 2019, Rohingya Muslims residing in a detention center in Saudi Arabia launched their 3rd hunger strike aimed at protesting their conditions of confinement. Unfortunately, the reaction by Saudi authorities was pretty predictable and was very harsh. We've talked about COVID-19 from the US to Israel to Lima, Peru. COVID-19 in prisons is not a good combination. We've seen folks facing extremely high rates of infection and risks of death. Peruvian prisons are no exception. This has also been an important story of resistance. In April of 2020, imprisoned persons at the Lurigancho prison in Lima, Peru, protested the insufficient government responses and protections against COVID-19. There was an uprising and it was a rebellion, and many prisoners, as you see in this photo, took to the roof of the prison and unfurled this banner that reads, at least in English, quote, we want COVID-19 tests, we have the right to live, end quote. So I could talk about resistance all day long, but what I want to do now is answer and ask the question, why environmental justice in prisons? And there's several reasons for that. In my conversations with currently and formerly incarcerated persons, almost to a person, they have said, we need radical reform. We need transformative policies to address the ills of prisons and incarceration in the US and countries around the world. And in many cases, folks are pushing and embracing abolition. And so for me, it gives me an opportunity to think beyond tweaks and basic reforms and to talk about transformative policy mechanisms that might address some of these cases. I always say that one of the lasting and most enduring and powerful successes and impacts of the environmental justice movement and scholarship has been to reframe and re-narrate what we even mean by quote unquote the environment. And we've done that successfully at the cultural and the discursive scale. So redefining the environment as places not only where megafauna and other fauna and flora live, but where human beings live, work, play, learn, and pray. We do all of those things in carceral spaces. And so why not add and do time to our definition of the environment? Another ongoing conversation and debate, of course, going back to the 80s in environmental justice studies, goes to that question of the minority move-in hypothesis, that maybe environmental injustice and environmental racism is a result not of people of color and poor folks being targeted by government agencies and polluting industries, but the other way around, people moving in to already polluted neighborhoods and residential areas that are low cost of living, it's cheap, the rent is affordable, etc. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that help us sleep at night? Paul Mohai, Robin Saha, and a number of other scholars have really put that idea to rest, that in the vast majority of cases, these folks are actually targeted by polluting industry and government agencies. Well, in prisons that are already sites of environmental injustice, you have very little agency in terms of determining where you're going to live, where you're going to reside. So the minority move-in hypothesis is in many ways totally moot. For me, as I've said, one of the most inspiring things that I've learned in my research is that incarcerated persons themselves are leaders in the environmental justice movement, which, according to the 13th Amendment, would mean that this is also in many ways a slave rebellion. Now, that might sound like hyperbole, but if you look at movements like the Free Alabama movement, folks in that community across the carceral systems in the state of Alabama and many other parts of the country and the world are actually using that language, that discourse, that we are going on strike because we refuse to be slaves to this system. And so that means the EJ movement in prisons is really continuing the work of abolitionists begun centuries ago. So what I want to do to wrap up here is to connect some dots and to move another argument forward, drawing again from the 13th Amendment idea. We see that at least in the US, and I would say beyond that, that human enslavement is still perfectly legal in the form of forced labor and servitude and just caging human beings. But human enslavement in the form of imprisonment is also an example of environmental injustice because it reflects the ways in which vulnerable and marginalized communities continue to be forced into violent captivity that results not only in their long-term social, public, and psychological related harms to the imprisoned and their communities, but also results in the simultaneous subjugation and harm to non-human natures, such as various ecosystems and habitats, land, water, and other species that are harmed during the construction and the routine day-to-day maintenance and functioning of that system. And I would point you toward the wonderful article in the Journal of Social Currents that just came out late last year by our colleagues Julius McGee, Patrick Greiner, and Carl Appleton, who show that prisons, both directly and indirectly, are a not insignificant contributor, that is to say, a significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. So check that out. And so finally, I want to argue that we might productively recast environmental injustice and environmental racism as a form of warfare. I talked about in the Karchuk prison of Tehran, a chemical warfare, pepper spraying, people being sprayed with OC spray. Well, we see more broadly, for me, environmental injustice as a form of warfare for three reasons. The first is that it involves direct assaults by states and state-supported organizations on entire communities. The second point is that that results in massive harm to those communities and our associated ecosystems. The third reason why I'm arguing that environmental injustice is a form of racism is because it is therefore designed not only to harm the folks that it is targeting, but it's designed to maintain the health of groups that are highly valued, people who matter, at the expense of those whose lives matter a whole lot less because they're essentially differentially valued. And that's also a form of what we call environmental privilege, right? That flip side of environmental injustice, the flip side of environmental racism, which is that we are not only targeting folks, we are securing privileges for the folks who are well-heeled, who are elite, who are not in those marginalized categories. And so this framing of environmental injustice for me is intended to offer an urgency-inducing way of thinking about the seriousness and long-term impacts of public policy and state-sponsored institutionalized violence, all of which are intensifying in this era of rising fascism. And finally, of course, this framing for me facilitates a grasp not just of the phenomenon of environmental privilege, right? But more importantly, how it is routinely weaponized. And so when we reframe environmental racism or injustice as warfare, then we can more clearly see how dominant institutions view those who suffer from and experience these ills, not as quote unquote environmental justice communities, which by the way is a phrase that drives me out of my mind because there's no environmental justice when we have all of these injustices. Doesn't see them as innocent people experiencing unfair environmental harms, but rather I see these folks as targets, even as enemies, whose communities, whose bodies, whose ways of knowing, whose forms of knowledge, whose territories must be contained, neutralized, and frequently destroyed. So something I'm not likely to do in most circumstances, try to end on a positive note. Let me say the following. One of the reasons why I am hopeful in this time of great tragedy and crisis and suffering is because prisoner rights and abolitionist movements have really begun to gain a lot of ground and support and cultural legitimacy as we've seen decarceration, defunding of the police, and decriminalization really take root. But there's still so much work to be done. And so if environmental racism and environmental injustice is a form of warfare, as I'm arguing, then perhaps one productive response would be to build an anti-militarist, feminist movement for peace and justice that really focuses on multi-species justice. And so I think to a great degree, the environmental justice movement has been that, but we still have so much work to do. So some might caution in order to make that happen that it would take a miracle to make real the changes needed in this world to secure environmental and climate and food justice. And that might be the case, but as my colleague George Lipsitz is fond of reminding us, we witness miracles all of the time, including the fact that Indigenous folks and people of color and marginalized folks on planet Earth who have been the targets of genocide and relentless dehumanization have survived and endured. That's a miracle. So I'd like to say that maybe we should recommit ourselves to making the miracle of environmental justice commonplace and an everyday reality. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions and comments and rejoinders.
Thank you very much, David, for this passionate plea you just gave us, and showing us the infinite array of repercussions that environmental injustice can have on people, and demonstrating the extraordinary complexity of this tragic intersectionality, using carceral spaces as a case study. I'd like now to invite our moderator, Professor John Chandra from our own Department of Sociology at SBU. John, thank you for having graciously accepted to co-host this event with us as an expert yourself in environmental sociology. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the meaningful contribution that the Department of Sociology is bringing to our institute and the degree in globalization studies we administer in it, in shapes of the faculty we use for our core courses and elective courses that they offer to our degree. Our two programs have a lot of synergies around global issues, and this is why today I'm particularly pleased to host two sociologists around the issue of the environment. John Chandra is both an environmental sociologist and a globalization specialist. He uses cross-national data to show that deforestation is largely the result of multinational corporations, international financial institutions, and repressive nations. One of the key conclusions of his work is that it is important to look beyond the traditional demographic causes of deforestation. He's also interested in how international non-governmental organizations are mobilizing to reduce various forms of environmental degradation. So welcome, John. In a way, David made our job a little easier today by raising so many questions, especially at the end of his talk. So I invite you to pick them up, to ask him question from expert to expert, then to expand the discussion to our audience. I've noticed a few experts in our audience, faculty in environmental sociology, but we also have our own students. I'll give you the floor, John, and people in the attendance, please do share your questions in the chat box of this Zoom forum. You may also want to take the floor with your question, in which case I still would like you to indicate that you would like to ask a question live, so that we can put you in the queue for the question and for John to call on you. Thank you very much. And John, it's your turn.
Thank you, Sophie, for that wonderful introduction and the opportunity for being here today. I'd like to begin by thanking David for an interesting, insightful, and inspiring presentation. Thanks to everyone for attending as well. I'll start by asking a question or two and encourage you to follow with your own inquiries and comments. Let me start with a couple of questions that are probably on people's minds with the election of a new administration here in the United States. David, what opportunities and potentials does the Biden-Harris administration hold for addressing environmental justice issues? Do you see the administration looking to improve other issues, whether they be inequality or criminal justice reform, as appears to be necessary from your talk?
Thanks so much, John. And I do want to say it's wonderful to be in conversation with you, someone whose work I have followed and admired for many years. So thank you for your extraordinary contributions to the field. Yeah, with respect to the Biden administration, I think like a lot of folks who are in the environmental and environmental justice community, I'm really pleased with much of what we're seeing. It's sort of like whiplash, going from, as to quote Biden, the former guy to the present guy, and it's really amazing to see the direct influence of environmental justice scholars and advocates on this current administration. I mean, it's perhaps the most progressive and full throttle approach I think we've seen to environmental justice, at least attempts at policymaking and the language around that in the White House, maybe forever. And also importantly, what we saw here, which we did not see during the Clinton era, was the environmental justice movement and politics and scholars really flexing their muscles to say, we aren't the same as the mainstream environmental movement, and that we need to take that seriously. And so your pick for EPA chair, administrator of Mary Nichols, she's certainly qualified, more than qualified, but not terribly popular with folks in communities fighting for environmental justice. And so therefore, we need to push for somebody who's really done that work, and they succeeded at doing so. That was amazing. Having said that, I do think we're going to have to push that administration much further with respect to questions around fracking, with respect to the Green New Deal, which is something that Biden hasn't, to my knowledge, sort of openly embraced. He's trying to thread that needle and deal with the polarized politics there of saying, let's focus on green jobs. And I applaud them for that. But this is a moment of hope where we're seeing the movement really flex its muscles. And I think understanding that we can't be passive about it. But having said that, we still come back to the problem of sort of relying on the state to sort of move us forward. And that ultimately makes us weak and precarious. I shouldn't say weak, but it's a limitation because the political winds will invariably change at some point. And so I'd like to see us create more enduring institutions and systems that can deliver environmental justice. So I hope I've answered part of your question.
Absolutely. In fact, you really set up nicely a follow-up that I would like to ask, which is I often, when I complete teaching in my environmental sociology course, students ask me what they can do to address as an individual, to address many of the issues you talk about. And I wanted you to talk about that. Perhaps you had some ideas that maybe can help inform this discussion. And perhaps maybe do you see more potential in an organizational response rather than an individual level response? Thanks.
Thanks for that question, and nicely set up my answer. I'm a sociologist, right? So but of course I live in a Western cultural context. So there's always that tension or perhaps that opportunity to look at the productive entanglement between the individual potential, the potential of an individual acting on their own, and the collective. And I often, will tell people, yeah, sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up to push a conversation. But most of the time, I think we are successful at creating dramatic and transformative and enduring change when we're working as collectives and through organizations. And so, like at Stony Brook, I think we will see at my institution as well. Students have done amazing work working as part of collectives, as part of organizations. There's a group here called the Environmental Justice Alliance, which really is paired up with the existing sort of more mainstream environmental group on campus and saying, let's not go to war with each other, let's work together, but understand that in some ways we can be autonomous. And those groups have really focused on doing work on campus, getting the campus, for example, in the 10 campus system, which is the largest university system in the United States, to divest from fossil fuels. Now there's some loopholes in that agreement, but that is a massive, massive victory for global climate change policy and climate justice that began with a small number of students who were asking exactly that question. They got faculty, they got staff, they got alumni, they got chancellors on board. And ultimately the university system said, you know what? Investing in fossil fuels is also financially precarious. And so for that reason, at least publicly, we're going to pull back from that. So that's an example that I'm proud of witnessing folks who are individuals who came together as a collective, produced really massively important change.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that example. I'm going to note that and use it in my class. So I appreciate that. I would like to open up on the floor as much as I would like to continue asking David my own personal questions. Perhaps any of my colleagues would like to jump in, or any of the other environmental sociologists. And David, while we wait for that to hear from them, because I'm sure they're chomping at the bit, I was wondering if you could talk, many of the issues and situations you described at the intersection of environmental justice and incarceration are occurring outside the United States. And I'm wondering, how do you see globalization as either complicating or perhaps enhancing the ability of organizations and individuals to address these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, prisons and carceral spaces, as I said earlier, don't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. However, we have both in the United States and globally, especially at this particular moment, right, with the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black lives, really seeing this ramp up of concern and unrest from last spring and summer, which really took on a global scale, where we saw places, as far away as Australia, where people were saying, yeah, Black Lives Matter here, but so do Aboriginal lives, so do First Nation lives. And so taking that idea, that narrative, that discourse, and adapting it for what was happening, what is happening in countries all over the world. But what we also see then is at this same moment, over just the last 9-10 months, this idea of defunding the police, this idea of decarceration, of decriminalization, of elevating and uplifting prisoner rights as human rights, really taking on way more urgency globally. And in many ways, the environmental justice movement, I think, is very well situated to address this, precisely because there are so many transnational and global networks for environmental justice, that I've studied in the past. Groups like, for example, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Incinerators are in many cases often, not only placed in close proximity to working class communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, but are often an issue for incarcerated communities, et cetera. We're also seeing this with the global network called the International Campaign for Responsible Technology, focused on the IT industry, the electronics industry, and making sure that that industry is more sustainable, is more accountable to frontline communities and its workers. That was early in the 2000s, a site where actually the first time I really started paying attention to prisoners as an environmental justice struggle, because even in the United States, when we weren't exporting our electronic waste in some cases, we were actually having it processed in prisons in the United States. The Atwater prison here in California was one of those sites. You probably remember that. And so this is a global concern, e-waste, that has intersected with prisoner rights for many years. So I think, again, the existing networks, the transnational networks that we have in place for environmental justice are a really nice sort of platform and terrain and infrastructure on which to pursue some of these concerns around imprisonment.
Excellent. Thank you, David. We have a question from Professor Peg Spitzer. Peg would like to know, how do we go about, or how we might change the legal system or the judicial system here in the United States? And what advice might you give students? Many students want to go on and become lawyers here at Stony Brook. If they're concerned with such issues, how they might shape their career or their career trajectory.
Sure. So I think there are a number of existing frameworks and strategies that can be used and have been used within the legal system to address some of these issues. Ultimately working within the system, it has its limitations, but it's gotten us given us some grounds for hope. So for example, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, 1970, really important legal framework that's set up to allow ordinary folks, citizens, denizens, to make their voices heard when there are various development projects that are being proposed in various parts of the nation. NEPA is all, and you can actually stop the construction of various projects if they don't, or if a judge agrees that they don't meet the letter of the law with respect to their environmental impact statements or environmental impact reports. That's been a really important tool for folks who are using that around the country. Here in California, we have our own version of that, which is called the California Environmental Quality Act, which was actually the law that was used, unfortunately, unsuccessfully, to try to stop the prison that was being built in Delano, California, back in the 1990s. But what's interesting on a global scale is that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, is one of our proudest exports. You may know this, that it has actually been adopted and adapted in many countries around the world. And my colleague here in Global Studies, Javiera Barandiaran, has written a book on, what is it called? Environment and Science in Chile, I think is the name of the title. And it's all about applying a science technology studies analysis of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, in Chile, and how that has become a venue and a terrain for environmental justice. I guess the last thing I'll say about that is, if we're going to dream big and dream large, then we have to ask, what is the law incapable of doing right now, and what could we use it for in terms of pushing beyond where we are? And so I was having a conversation with an undergraduate student yesterday who's studying prisons as an environmental justice issue, and she was pointing out that occupational safety and health protections, minimum wage, protections against all sorts of environmental risks are in place for those of us who are on the outside of prisons, but they are explicitly not applied to people inside carceral spaces. And I see that as not only a tragedy, but as an opportunity for folks who might want to say, hey, maybe we can push the law, the legal framework to address that. So I think there are a number of angles and pathways where we could do that. Oh, John, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. David, I really appreciate the optimistic tone. I'm going to follow up next with a question from one of my wonderful colleagues, Kristen Charette, who's also an environmental sociologist. So Kristen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk, and John, for allowing me to not have to type my question in. But we have, so I'm really intrigued about this. Up front, you're talking about the idea of moving these analyses beyond the state. And I actually am. So I'm teaching environmental sociology this semester, and many of my students are here and have been here, and we just read your chapter on the state and policy and the 20 lessons in environmental sociology. And so for a bit of context, but so okay, so I'm really intrigued about this idea of going beyond the state, but it seems that the discussion keeps coming back to it. So at the end of the day, right, the scholar, the lawyers who are going to try to get things changed, and like at the end of the day, we're all just targeting the state. That's where the that's the only entity that has the power to enforce these things, right? And so I'm not sure, perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure if I misunderstood your explanation of what it means to move beyond the state, but perhaps it also, it keeps coming to mind, like the idea of abolishing the prison system sounds so, it's huge, it's intriguing, and especially in this particular context that we're in right now. But what does that look like? So what does it, what does a post prison industrial complex system where we still have to deal with people transgressing, people doing things that we want to make sure that they aren't subjecting the population to, what does that look like?
Thank you, Kristen. Like 12 questions that I'm going to answer in 30 seconds. No, I really appreciate that. No, that's right on the mark. So I guess what I would say in response to much of this is, so thinking about abolition or moving beyond the state. I guess I have a number of responses to that. I mean, the first is that I'm very much interested in, not so much, and every abolitionist I know will probably say this, and I would agree with them. It's not so much about, hey, let's go attack the state and dismantle it, as it is about, because that's probably a losing game, right? What it really is primarily about, at least in my mind, is about trying to build alternatives, right? Community-based alternatives that deliver the kinds of goods and services that we all need. We all need to survive, that we all generally look to the state to provide, but particularly in marginalized communities, the state doesn't do a very good job of delivering. And so it's always funny to me when people say, oh, that's a pipe dream and we got to stick with the state. And I go, really? I mean, with the same institutional apparatus and mechanism that is starving people, that is perpetrating mass atrocities, you want to stick with that? So that's the first thing, that again, it's let's focus energy on building networks and institutions that can deliver those goods that people need, rather than, I think, falling into the trap that I often fall into, which is creating a conversation that sounds like I don't want us to have those services and goods that people need. And what can that look like? Well, for years, one of my favorite organizations that I've worked with is the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. So this actually may be more of an example of social change that is trying to create social change without directly targeting the state. One of the things that Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition is very good at is creating, and we've seen this across a number of movements, very, very good at taking a look at the IT industry, the electronics industry. It's like, you're polluting the hell out of the planet. You're poisoning workers and communities, frontline communities. And that thing over there called the state has done a crap job of regulating you. So what we're going to do is we're going to engage in a form of community-based regulation, community-based accountability. It's definitely imperfect, definitely flawed, but we create a scorecard, right? We've seen these report cards of which companies are doing a good job and which companies are doing a crap job. And we will publicize that and use that to move the dial of this industry to greater sustainability. You sign this pledge of true environmental stewardship and sustainability, Dell Corporation did this, HP, Compaq, IBM, Apple, the entire system of the University of California, many throughout the European Union. We got them all to sign this pledge. So we were focusing on the state and non-state actors. And those non-state actors are some of the biggest corporations on planet Earth. So we don't even have to worry about quote unquote state policy to make dramatic changes in people's lives. Another example we're all probably aware of, Color of Change, an amazing organization that has these online petitions targeting companies as much as they're targeting government agencies around racial violence, racism, et cetera, and has had enormous success in getting these companies to change their policies and practices. So these are examples where we don't even have to imagine. We can look, observe, witness, and participate in actually changing dramatically the policies and practices of massive corporations that have extraordinary impacts on our ecosystems and on human life. Finally, I'll say that here in Southern California, we can look no further than the Los Angeles basin, where the indigenous Tongva Gabrielina people have lived for centuries. And in Kelly Lytle Hernandez's award-winning book, City of Inmates, for which she won the Genius Grant, she points out that the Tongva people have no history, zero history of imprisonment, of zero history of human caging, of enslavement. So in this very place that is the largest jailer on planet Earth, Los Angeles County, we have this proud, rich history of an abolitionist vision that has been here long before the word abolition even emerged. So finally, I guess I would say that I'm a pragmatic person, and so drawing from the work of Arturo Escobar, James Scott, and other scholars, I believe at this point we have to work with and through the state to get some of this work done. So I totally agree with you that most of the time we are going to have to be circling back to this conversation and this action. And so I'm very pragmatic about that. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, David. We actually have a related question coming from the University of South Florida from Assistant Professor Jamie Summer. Jamie would like to know how you see a environmental justice movement challenging privatization, whether it's of natural resources or of prisons, or perhaps both at the same time.
Really important point, particularly in the context of this conversation around the state, right? So thank you, Jamie. I think, for me, and I've been recently, if you've been paying attention to some of my work, gravitating toward not only sort of anti-capitalist approaches, but also anarchist approaches. And it's funny because so many folks who are maybe environmental justice scholars or activists, might see themselves as anti-capitalists, but anarchism or sort of post-state solutions is just a bridge too far. I go, yeah, but anarchism, and I'm seeing Rachel McCain smile there, anarchism is fundamentally about democracy. It is fundamentally about confronting all forms of domination and hierarchy and trying to make sure that all of us are thriving and that we are, making decisions in ways that are consensus-based, that are respectful of all voices. It goes back to that idea of indispensability. And so privatization is as much a problem and a challenge as is state control over our lives and over our institutions. So I really appreciate that point. And specifically the point about prisons, some of the most horrendous examples of environmental injustice and racism that I've come across in this project are not only in state-owned or operated facilities, but definitely in private prisons, and particularly in immigration detention centers. So the GEO group, for example, and a number of these other corporations, the purpose there is to house people and to do so with a profit, right? And this, of course, has echoes of the convict leasing era, where in the sense that when we look at the work of historians who have pointed out, if you compare the well-being of folks under chattel slavery to that under convict leasing, which is much more of a corporate, privatized, but sort of state corporate alliance, the life chances of folks under convict leasing were far worse because those employers, those enslavers had no incentive to keep these people alive. And so I don't know that I would go so far as to say we see a similar dynamic in private prisons, but certainly with corporations like Aramark, which is one of the primary providers of quote unquote food in the prison system, we are seeing horrifying examples of how the logic of expendability and the logic of profitability in our carceral facilities is leading to enormous public health problems and in some cases starvation for folks. So I think an answer, a productive response to that actually brings us back to abolition. If we focus on abolition, then we don't even really have to worry, at great level and granularity with this question of state versus private if we get rid of prisons altogether and embrace forms of restorative justice, going back to Kristen's question of how do we address accountability and the fact that there are frankly dangerous people out here who we need to address their behavior. And I think there are ways to do that, but privatization has certainly been an example, a very poor example for doing that. So hopefully that partially answers your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important point, right? And so putting the issue of privatization right at the center, right? That's what like abolitionist thinking can do, which is really a much better way of thinking about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, David. Are there any additional questions, perhaps from students that are out there in the audience? I know there are a number of classes that are here today. Sophie, how are we doing on time?
Oh, it looks like we may have a last question. I was just going to say that we almost out of time, but we can certainly accommodate these questions. So please go ahead and read it if you can.
Absolutely. Dave, this is a question
Thank you,
from
John.
a student. It may take me a little bit of time to make sure that I get it correctly. In the context of the reification of the state as a source of environmental justice solutions and state-sponsored violence in carceral states, I'm curious if Dr. Pellow would comment on the thesis put forth by some Steven Pinker in Our Better Angels, for example, and that we are living in less violent times. Perhaps
Sure.
math student.
Thank you for that question, Mike. Let's see. So this reminds me in some ways of the conversation, the debate between Jared Diamond and David Nybert, which is more of a debate that David Nybert has initiated in response to Jared Diamond's claims that as much as it is true that throughout human and non-human history, our multi-species history, on the whole, Diamond essentially makes the argument that we are on the upward trajectory, that on the whole, we are seeing more progress, less violence. David Nybert, in his book, Animal Oppression, Human Violence, I think it is called, pushes back against that and goes sort of the long arc of history and says, actually, empirically, I don't know that that's a defensible statement. And if, I could look at any number of other indicators. I mean, we look at the violence of inequality, which is as much or as great as it's ever been in human history. We look at the violence of global anthropogenic climate change, which is as harsh as it's been in eons. We look at the violence of enslavement itself, where right here in 2021 on planet Earth, we have more people living and working under conditions of slavery and enslavement than ever, all, by the way, under the supervision of these wonderful things called modern nation states. I don't know that one can credibly make that argument that we are living in less violent times, particularly if we are paying attention to marginalized communities, and particularly if we're looking at the literally billions of non-human animals who are consumed on a daily and annual basis. So I'm not sure how one could imagine that argument holds water, but from a multi-species and environmental justice standpoint and a long arc of history, it simply doesn't. The data just don't support it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a clear answer. David, thank you very much. Thank you very much, John, for moderating this event and taking all the questions. I'm glad we ended with a student's question. I want to thank those students who attended this this event with us, and the faculty too, who invited their students to come and join us, which leads me to say that for the students who are here and interested in delving a little further on the topics of environmental sustainability or social justice or injustice, GLI will be offering some summer courses. And two of them are related. We'll have one of them on global sustainability in summer 1, and in summer 2 we have one on intersectionality of class, gender, and race at the global scale, taught by a sociologist. Okay, so stay tuned for those. For those of you who follow us on the social media, we'll announce them. And I just want to wish everybody a good day, and thank you for your attendance today. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Really, really wonderful to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, John. Thank all of you for engaging me.
Thanks so much, David.
Absolutely.